Before I proceed with this video, another brief reminder that if you're watching this video or any other video made by us, either at the Duran or on my channel, Alexander Mercouris, or on Alex Christophorou's channel on Rumble, then if you go to the top of the video, you will see a red maroon button. If you press that red maroon button, it will take you directly to our locals homepage, where you can join our locals community, participate as a full member if you so choose, which will enable you to participate in my live streams, which take place exclusively on locals every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. And also you can post your own exclusive content and comment on the threads of the various other articles and videos that you see posted there. Well, today is Easter Day in the Orthodox world. I am a member of the Orthodox community. I wish everybody in the Orthodox world, my fellow Orthodox Christians, a happy and joyous Easter. Christ, as we say, in our world is risen, and I believe many Western Christians say it as well. Well, this Easter, like the Easter which Western Christians celebrated last week, is of course being celebrated in time of war, and that's particularly poignant, I should say, in Russia and Ukraine in terms of the Orthodox Easter, because of course these are both Orthodox countries. In fact, the Russian Orthodox Church has a very powerful, very large following in Ukraine, especially amongst Russian speakers there, but also, by the way, amongst many Ukrainian speakers. But having said that, the war does go on, and of course at a time of war, one is always especially concerned and thoughtful about the victims of the war, who are not just the young soldiers who are dying on the field of battle or being wounded or taken prisoner there, but of course their families. So I want to say also that my thoughts are with all of these people on this Easter Day, and I do hope and pray that this war will end quickly, and that, in my opinion, reason will finally prevail, and a peace settlement will be agreed. Though I have to say it frankly, I see little sign of that at the moment. I understand that the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, is on his way to Moscow to talk to President Putin. To be frank about it, he should have done that weeks ago. It's astonishing that he has waited and delayed so long. He has taken an extremely strong pro-Ukrainian, pro-Western position throughout this conflict, which I think has severely damaged his position as a potential mediator, and I think the Russians will be deeply skeptical of him. It is because the Russians have a strong commitment to the United Nations, which, by the way, is not altruistic. It is very important for the Russians and for the Chinese as well that as permanent members of the Security Council, they have right of veto and are able to rely on the doctrines and practices set out in the UN Charter to secure their United Nations position. Anyway, it is very fortunate for Mr. Guterres that the Russians remain committed for those reasons to the United Nations, and for that reason that they have agreed to receive him, that he's due to meet first with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and afterwards that he will have a meeting, probably a brief meeting, with President Vladimir Putin. But anyway, the fact is he is going to Ukraine. It doesn't seem as if he has any plan or any ideas. He's apparently going to he's going to Russia. Apparently he's also going to go to Ukraine. It's, as I said, terrible that he's left it as late as this. Hopefully, and possibly, just possibly, he might provide some mechanism for transmitting ideas between Moscow and Kiev, though to be straightforward about it, I don't think so. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about him. I think he's done damage to the United Nations and to the position of the Secretary General, and I consider his trip to Moscow and subsequently to Kiev to be tokenism, and tokenism that has come altogether too late. I'm going to say that I think exactly the same about the trip by Blinken and Austin, the US Secretary of State and the US Defense Secretary, to Kiev as well. These are token moves intended to show support to the Zelensky government. Notice that President Biden himself is not going to Kiev and apparently has no intention of doing so. And I know that this has been commented upon in Ukraine and commented upon unfavorably. Well, anyway, I'm going to put aside diplomatic discussions. I'm going to briefly turn to the military situation. And there's not much more to report over and above my lengthy discussion of the military situation in my previous video. What is happening, and this is absolutely clear to me, is that the Russians are slowly edging ever closer to the main concentrations of Ukrainian forces in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and in the area opposite Donetsk on their side of the conflict line. And at the same time, they are gradually tightening their grip on the northern cauldron around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Now, what I'm hearing, and this is partly confirmed by some statements made by the Ukrainian governor of Lugansk province, is that the Ukrainians are apparently considering some sort of retreat from some of the places in Lugansk province, Lugansk region, that they've been clinging on to. The governor explained this on the basis of the massive Russian artillery shelling that is taking place in this, all across the front actually, but which is making apparently the position of Ukrainian troops in some of these outlying places increasingly untenable. Well, there's been much discussion about this over the last 3 days or so, and the rumours about this are that the Ukrainians are considering a pullback from the town of Severodonetsk, which has been virtually surrounded by the forces of the militia of the Lugansk People's Republic and by the Russians, and that they're going to withdraw to Lysychansk, which is the place which the Ukrainians where the Ukrainians have now established the regional administration, their own regional administration, given that the capital of Lugansk region, Lugansk city, is of course well within the territory of the Lugansk People's Republic. So this would be a withdrawal from Severodonetsk, a very difficult thing, I suspect, to carry out if one looks at the maps. I'm not a military person, but I would have thought that a retreat from a city that is almost encircled runs the risk of exposing the retreating troops to devastating fire in open country. So that may be a difficult operation to execute. And I would say if it does take place, well, it would be a first. It would be the first occasion that the Ukrainians have voluntarily or have made a decision to pull back from a place that is undefendable. And it's something which, in terms of Severodonetsk and other parts of Donbass, I think they should have done a long time ago. And in fact, what I am getting, the impression I'm getting of the fighting in Donbass is essentially as follows. The Ukrainians are clinging on to various places in central Donetsk, in Lugansk regions, in various areas of the Donbass, and of course in Mariupol, in the Azovstal factory, all places which are basically undefendable. And the reason that the rationale for doing this is supposedly to strengthen Ukraine's position in negotiations with Russia. Problem is, those negotiations are essentially at a standstill because Ukraine has been unwilling to make some of the substantive concessions that it needs to make in order to seal a deal with the Russians. The Russians have said as a minimum demand that they want Ukraine to concede the independence of the two republics, Donetsk and Lugansk, the two Donetsk and Lugansk republics, whose independence the Russians have recognized, and to concede that independence along the territory of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. Well, the Ukrainians have refused to do that. They seem to be edging towards doing it in the negotiations, the discussions that took place a month ago in Istanbul. But apparently they retreated from making that concession, and from that concession in subsequent talks, apparently on advice from the Americans and the British. And so the Ukrainians are clinging on in Donbass to what are increasingly precarious and isolated positions, and they're doing it in order to strengthen their position in negotiations, which, as I said, at the moment are essentially at a standstill. And these troops that are increasingly isolated in Donbass are now subject to overwhelming shelling by the Russians and their allied troops. Now, I'm not an expert on military strategy, but I have been aware for a fairly long time that the Russian military doctrine, land-ground tactics, center very much on artillery. The Russians have always regarded artillery as the queen of the battle, and they've done so, well, ever since the 18th century, and some say even before then. And the Russians, as a result, bring overwhelming artillery power to their battles. This is very much a feature, by the way, of the battles of the Second World War. And of course, it's been a feature in various battles ever since. I remember reading an account of the brief war that took place in 2008 between Russia and Georgia over the disputed territory of South Ossetia. And I remember a Georgian soldier describing the effect of Russian artillery fire as something out of hell. And the point to understand is that it isn't just that the artillery barrages are massive when they happen, it is that they happen almost continuously. And the Russians have apparently successfully opened up some of the railway systems in this part of the world, which means that they're able to resupply their artillery forces in Donbass with vast amounts of munitions, which Russian factories are designed to pour out in massive quantities. And of course, most of this armament, these shells, these munitions, reach the battlefield by train. And they're just able to go on shelling these troops until eventually the troops themselves find it increasingly difficult to keep fighting. Their fortifications are severely damaged. And it's at that point, by the way, that the Russians traditionally unleash their armoured forces. That was the pattern during the Second World War, and it's very much the pattern in Donbass. It's heavy, very heavy artillery fire. And this is obviously taking a heavy toll. But there is also another aspect of this, which I find even more disturbing, which is that as these troops, these Ukrainian troops, who are increasingly, as I said, isolated, clinging on to places in Donbass, are coming in for this relentless artillery fire, the Ukrainians have been making ever more urgent attempts to break through to them to try to reinforce them, to send supplies to them, to find ways of ending their isolation. And this has led to a whole series of encounter battles with the Russians, especially in the areas south of ETHEREUM and also further north in Kharkiv region. And the story of all these attacks, these Ukrainian counterattacks, is of the Ukrainians being repulsed with heavy losses. And one gets reports, and I don't think these are really disputable, of Ukrainian troops being pushed back, losing more tanks, losing more armored vehicles, of which Ukraine anyway is running short. And of course, there's also reports of whole Ukrainian formations being destroyed over and above the Ukrainian formations further west, some of which are also being very badly knocked about by these long-range Russian missile strikes. Now, that's my understanding of the general situation on the battlefield. Note that there are very few Western journalists operating in eastern Ukraine. This has been true, by the way, almost from the first day of the war. Every so often, some brave soul from the Western media ventures there, but compared with the enormous coverage of the fighting that used to take place in and around Kiev in the early period of the fighting, when of course there were large numbers of Western journalists in Kiev, they tend not to go to Donbass, presumably because the situation there is just too dangerous. And unfortunately, this gives a distorted sense of the battle, but it also means that it's not always easy to get a full picture of what is happening. But relying on sources of people like, for example, Jacob Dreisen at the Dreisen Report, who are able to keep track of events in this part of the world, who seem to have familiarity with the language and the various languages, and who are able to understand and study the photographic and video evidence which is coming out of this part of the world. I think what I have just described is a reasonably accurate picture of what is going on. And at the same time, it's the case that even as these enormous amount of artillery fire is taking place, as the Russians are able to drive back these Ukrainian counterattacks, inflicting heavy losses on the Ukrainians, that the Russian troops, as I said, continue to edge ever closer to the main concentrations of Ukrainian troops in places like Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Severodonetsk that I mentioned earlier, other places also, and the forces that are gathered there themselves are coming in for increasingly heavy strikes. And all of this is happening at one and the same time as the Russians are launching long-range missile strikes. Some of these missile strikes, by the way, launched by, obviously, cruise missile strikes, but they're launched by the Russian Air Force. So they're launched from aircraft, like Tupolev 95 bombers, long-range strikes which are now taking place, and which are taking place in enormous quantities all over Ukraine. Now, when I say enormous quantity, it's true that the Russians have never launched the number of missiles in Ukraine on anything like the scale that the United States did, for example, when it targeted Iraq in the 1991 and 2003 wars. But one does get the sense that these missile strikes launched by the Russians, which are in very significant numbers, nonetheless, and with the tempo steadily growing, are very carefully targeted. And they're targeting railways, bridges, munition stores, command centers, barracks, those sort of things. And there was one big missile strike in Odessa, which in an airfield near Odessa, which the Ukrainians have confirmed, and which the Ukrainians say, which the Russians say, destroyed a large ammunitions and depot where a lot of military equipment Ukraine has received from the West was gathered and which has been destroyed. Now, I would stress that this is a Russian claim. It's not been confirmed by Ukraine, and it's certainly not been confirmed by the Western powers. And it seems to me that this attrition, which, as I said, is what the Russians are how they're deliberately waging this war, is taking an enormous human toll of Ukraine, of its human resources, of the young men who, as I said, are being thrown into the battle, and of Ukraine's increasingly limited supplies of armored vehicles, of aircraft, and of course of artillery. Now, the Western powers have tried to the extent that they can to fill the gaps, to plug the gaps, and there's been a recent attempt to try and arrange for Ukraine to be provided with artillery weapons by the West. The United States, for example, is supplying 90 howitzers. Other countries are also supplying artillery. But if you look at the losses Ukraine is suffering, and obviously these are mainly taken from Russian sources, but they do seem to be corroborated by things that the Ukrainians are saying, one gets the impression that the number of artillery pieces the West is sending to Ukraine come nowhere close to filling the gaps. And I do wonder how much longer this can go on for. If the Ukrainians are pulling back from Severodonetsk, if they're really considering that, even if they're not pulling back from Severodonetsk, if they're pulling back from other places less important than Severodonetsk, if they accept that their position of some of their troops is becoming untenable, that they have to make these kind of pullbacks, then I come back to the point I have made in so many programs on this channel. Surely the right thing is to negotiate some kind of truce and pull all of these troops out of Donbass. Perhaps at that point, some kind of more defendable line can be created further west. And in the meantime, the right thing to do, surely, is to seek a negotiation which will end in some kind of peace. Now, I would have thought that is the obvious approach to take. It seems to me that we are not taking that approach. Ukraine is not taking that approach because of political problems within Ukraine and because of the Western powers doing what they have been consistently doing ever since Ukraine started to edge into conflict with Russia following the Orange Revolution in 2004, which is to take the hardest possible line with the Russians and refuse to compromise. And I do wonder whether this has ever been good or wise counsel for Ukraine. For the record, I'm going to say that I think the Ukrainians are probably at some point going to pull back from Severodonetsk. I suspect the reason they're going to do it is because of the pullback, the fact that Ukrainians seem to have lost control of all or most of the key town of Rubizhnoye, which is on the supply lines to Severodonetsk, and there's some indications that they're now being gradually ground down further south in defending a rather more important place called Popaznaya, where the militia, the Donbass militia, seem to be making steady incremental advances, and where there was reports that an entire Ukrainian formation has now been surrounded near the railway station and is likely to face defeat. Now, that seems to me the wise thing to do, to pull back from all of these places. And another place where I think the Ukrainians should pull back from also is Azovstal. What purpose is there in holding on in Azovstal, having all of these fighters in Azovstal? There's again huge amount of debate about how many exactly there are, holding out in these bunkers underneath this factory in Mariupol, when all of the rest of the town has been captured by the Russians, and when these fighters are essentially trapped underground. And there's been more videos coming out of Azovstal. The soldiers there apparently are now claiming or complaining that they're running out of food and that they've run out of medicines and medical care, that they can't treat their wounded. And of course, by their own account, which by the way I tend to believe, their families are trapped there underground with them. Surely the right thing to do is for the Ukrainian government to order these people to at least, or if you believe the Russians, to consent to what these troops themselves have been asking Kiev to allow them to do, which is to surrender to the Russians. There's no evidence that the Russians maltreat their prisoners. I've noticed that even the Ukrainians don't seem to be making that particular allegation. And of course, these troops in particular, one would have thought, because of all the publicity around Mariupol, the Russians would be particularly careful to make sure that they were not mistreated. And the same, of course, applies even more to the civilians, some of whom are children, who are there in the bunkers under this factory, facing relentless shelling, because the shelling of Azovstal continues, the bombing of Azovstal continues. More people are dying there every day. And if it's true that medicines are in short supply, well, it seems that presumably the people there who get wounded, and there must be increasing numbers of those, the Ukrainians claim that the troops there claim that the number runs into the hundreds. Well, surely these people also should be put out of their agony. I am very tired of reading all of these heroic stories that one reads in Western media about the fighting in Ukraine. All of the people who write in this way about the heroic courage of Ukrainian soldiers who won't give up in the face of insurmountable odds, and who are basically egging them on, or basically even telling them to go on fighting, as does their government. All of these people are writing from a long distance away from the battlefield. And I wonder sometimes about the degree of emotional empathy that they have with these people who are in these factories, in this factory in Mariupol, and who are also dying in places like Kramatorsk and Slavyansk and Severodonetsk, which realistically are going to be lost to Ukraine, whatever happens. So, on this Easter day, I'm going to finish this program by repeating what I have said on previous occasions. This is not a demand or request, a suggestion for Ukraine's complete capitulation. It is rather a suggestion that the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian officials, Ukrainian commanders on the ground finally do what I think commanders in battle ought always to do, which is to show some sense of responsibility for the fate of their soldiers, keeping their troops in undefendable positions like Azovstal, possibly Severodonetsk, perhaps other places in Donbass, seems to me wrong. Pull them all back, even if that means, or if that can't be done, agree the terms of their surrender with the Russians. Give these people life, especially now on Easter Day, the Orthodox Easter Day, and negotiate seriously and sincerely to bring this war to an end. Well, that's my brief summary of the state of the fighting in Donbass. I am afraid the counsel I've given will almost certainly not be accepted. I predict, therefore, that the fighting will go on. I suspect in Donbass it will go on for several weeks. I shudder to think how many people are dying as a result. And of course, as I've made it fairly clear, I doubt that the outcome is going to be any different from the one that I've said. Well, thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon. Again, I wish you my Easter greetings. I would remind you that you can find us on our other platforms, Rumble and Locals and other platforms too. Don't forget that we're also on other platforms like the new free speech platform, SuperU and ODYSEE and others like that. And of course, you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And of course, don't forget to check out our shop, where you can find lots of great things like our famous magic mugs, and also you can support us by checking your subscription to this channel and by clicking the like button if you've liked this video. Well, thank you again for me today. Thank you again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a very good day. And if you're celebrating Easter today, as I am, have a very good Easter.